The air inside the massive auditorium pulsed with a strange mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. Thousands of people filled the seats, their chatter rising and falling like waves. The bright stage lights beamed down with such intensity that even the most confident performers felt exposed under their glare. For many, this was the dream, the chance of a lifetime to stand on the stage of America's Got Talent and prove they belonged. But when the host announced the next contestant, a hush fell across the room. From the shadows of backstage, a small figure appeared. A boy no more than 12 years old, stepped carefully forward, his hand tightly gripping his mother's. The spotlight followed them, revealing a child in a simple white shirt and slightly oversized black pants. His hair was neatly combed, but it was his face that made the audience lean forward. His eyes, though open, did not move like most children's. They seemed distant, searching, unfocused, eyes that had never seen the lights, the crowd, or even his own reflection. His name was Mateo. The boy's mother gently whispered encouragements as they reached the center of the stage. Mateo moved slowly, counting his steps in his mind, guided by his mother's steady hand. Every movement seemed deliberate, careful, cautious. But when he reached the microphone, he stood tall. For a moment, his face turned upward toward the light, almost as if he could feel its warmth on his skin. The judges studied him with curiosity. Sofia Vergara tilted her head, eyes softening. Heidi Klum gave an encouraging smile. Howie Mandel leaned forward, hands clasped, and Simon Cowell, known for his piercing critiques, sat with arms folded, his expression unreadable. Mateo's mother placed his hand gently on the microphone, then slowly let go, retreating a few steps to stand at the edge of the stage. The boy's fingers lingered on the mic, feeling the cold metal, grounding himself. The silence stretched longer than usual. Finally, Simon leaned toward his microphone. "Hello," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "What's your name?" Mateo's lips curled into a shy smile. He spoke softly but clearly, his accent carrying the lilt of his Filipino roots. "My name is Mateo, and how old are you?" Simon asked. 12, he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "And what will you be doing for us today?" Mateo paused. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening not just to Simon's voice but to the sound of the entire room. The breathing, the faint rustle of programs, the murmur of the waiting crowd. Then, with a steady breath, he said, "I will sing because music is how I see the world." The words struck the audience like a gentle thunderclap. A collective silence fell over the hall. Some gasps escaped, followed by a ripple of murmurs. In the front row a woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. The statement wasn't rehearsed, wasn't polished. It was simply the truth of a boy who had no sight but carried visions inside his heart. Simon's face shifted just slightly. His eyebrows drew together as though he hadn't expected such honesty. He leaned back in his chair, his usual armor of sarcasm cracking just a little. Mateo's mother clasped her hands tightly together at the side of the stage, whispering silent prayers. She had watched her son grow up navigating a world that didn't always understand him. She knew the struggles. The cruel comments from other children, the endless medical visits, the nights when he would cry and ask why he couldn't see like everyone else. And she knew too, that music had saved him. From the first time his little fingers pressed against a piano key, Mateo had discovered a way to paint the world he couldn't see. Now, standing on the biggest stage of his life, her son faced an audience of millions. Mateo shifted his feet, gripping the microphone more firmly. He took a deep breath, the kind that trembles in the chest before courage steadies it. The stage lights glistened in his dark, unseeing eyes, reflecting hope even if he could not witness it himself. Somewhere in the back, a child in the audience whispered, "He's blind," and the words seemed to echo through the silence. But Mateo didn't falter. Instead, he lifted his chin, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I don't see faces," he said softly, almost to himself, but the microphone carried his words across the room. "But I can feel kindness, and I can hear hearts. That's what music is for me." The words weren't scripted, they came naturally like the melody of his life, and it made the crowd lean in closer. Simon tapped his pen against the table, his gaze still fixed on the boy. Something about Mateo's calm presence unsettled him. He had seen countless contestants, many talented, many unforgettable, but this child seemed different. There was no performance in his demeanor, no attempt to impress, only truth. The host backstage shifted uneasily, whispering to the crew, "This is going to be something special." And in that moment, before a single note had been sung, the story had already begun to take shape, not just of a boy chasing a dream, but of a child about to show the world that sometimes, the deepest vision doesn't come from the eyes at all. The piano was rolled gently onto the stage. Mateo felt his way to the bench, his fingers brushing against the smooth wood, memorizing its shape. His mother guided his hand to the keys before stepping back once more. The boy sat, placed both hands on the ivory keys, and let out one final breath. The entire theater seemed to hold its breath with him. What would happen next, no one could predict. But everyone, judges, audience, millions watching at home, already sensed they were about to witness something unforgettable. The moment hung, fragile, electric, waiting for the very first note. The theater was hushed as though every person inside had agreed, without speaking, to hold their breath. All eyes were on the small boy seated at the grand piano. His small hands hovered over the ivory keys, trembling for just a moment before settling into place. Mateo took another deep breath, the kind that shakes at first but steadies when courage finally wins over fear. His thin frame looked so small against the polished piano, but the way he sat, upright, listening, ready, made him appear larger than life. The lights gleamed across his face, catching in the sheen of his unfocused eyes. He pressed the first chord. The sound rippled through the vast theater, a soft, resonant tone that seemed to touch every wall, every seat, every heart. Then, as the melody unfolded, his voice rose, fragile at first, like a bird testing its wings, and then fuller, stronger, unshakably simple. Not a show-stopping pop anthem, not a flashy piece meant to dazzle. Instead, it was something stripped bare, raw with honesty. The kind of song that didn't just sit in your ears, but traveled straight to your chest and stayed there. When the world feels dark, I still hear a song. Even when I close my eyes, I know where I belong. The words seemed to float, carrying a weight far heavier than his 12 years should have known. But that was Mateo. His blindness had sharpened his heart, deepened his soul. He sang not like a child, but like someone who had learned to survive loss, loneliness, and the cruel silence of a world he could never see. The audience leaned forward. A mother in the third row instinctively wrapped her arms around her daughter, her face wet with unexpected tears. A man near the aisle closed his eyes, clutching his chest as if the song had unlocked a wound he had long hidden. And Simon Cowell sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the boy. His pen, which usually tapped against the table impatiently, now lay forgotten. His jaw tightened. It was as though the lyrics, sung by a blind child from the Philippines, were chiseling away at a wall Simon himself had built years ago to keep emotion at bay. Mateo's voice swelled as he reached the chorus, unafraid, unbroken. I don't need to see the stars, to know they shine above. I can feel the light inside, I can hear the sound of love. The note carried long and trembling, echoing through the room. By the time it faded, the audience was already lost. Some clutched tissues, some clasped their hands, and others simply stared with wide, glistening eyes. The raw purity of his voice peeled away the layers of cynicism and disbelief, reminding everyone in the room of something they had forgotten: the human soul's ability to rise despite everything. Heidi Klum whispered under her breath, "Oh my God!" Sofia Vergara covered her mouth, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Howie Mandel shook his head slowly, stunned into silence. But Mateo didn't notice any of it. His eyes, though unseeing, seemed to gaze upward, as though searching for something beyond the ceiling, beyond the lights, something only he could feel. His small hands moved confidently over the keys, filling the air with chords that seemed impossibly alive for a boy so young. It wasn't perfection in the technical sense. There were slight hesitations, tiny cracks in his voice, but those imperfections were what made it extraordinary. They were reminders that this wasn't just a performance. It was confession. It was truth. As his voice softened for the bridge, the theater grew impossibly still. Even when I stumble, even when I fall, the music lifts me higher. It's the greatest gift of all. The boy's words carried more than melody. They carried the weight of nights he had spent crying into his pillow, wondering why he was different. They carried the sound of his mother's encouragement when the world seemed too cruel. They carried the quiet determination of a child who refused to be defined by what he lacked, but by what he gave. By the final chorus, the room was no longer an audience watching a contestant. It was a community sharing in the rawest, most human of moments. The walls between strangers dissolved, and for those few minutes, everyone in that theater was united, not by a competition, but by the voice of a child who sang from his soul. Mateo reached the final note, a soaring, trembling sound that filled the space like sunlight pouring through a window. He held it as long as his lungs allowed, and when it finally faded, the silence that followed was deafening. It was not the silence of indifference, it was the silence of awe. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one clapped, no one even breathed too loudly. It was as if the room itself wanted to honor the echo of the last note, unwilling to let it go. And then it happened. A young man in the back stood, his palms met together in a single clap, sharp and echoing. It broke the spell, and suddenly, the entire theater erupted. The applause roared, growing louder, fuller, until the floor shook with the force of thousands of hands coming together. People leapt to their feet, shouts, whistles, cheers filled the air, wrapping Mateo in sound. The boy's lips curved into a small, humble smile. He couldn't see the standing ovation, but he could hear it. He could feel it. The thunder of applause became its own kind of vision, one that painted the room in colors only he could understand. Mateo bowed his head slightly, fingers still resting on the keys. He didn't cry, didn't seem overwhelmed. Instead, he breathed deeply, as though taking in the sound like oxygen, like nourishment. For him, this was more than applause, it was proof that he wasn't alone. Backstage, crew members who had seen thousands of acts wiped at their eyes. The host, usually quick with a joke, had his hand pressed over his heart. Even the security guards at the back of the hall exchanged quiet glances, their tough exteriors cracked by a 12-year-old boy's voice. On stage, Mateo sat quietly, waiting for the noise to fade, unaware that something even more profound was happening at the judges' table. Simon Cowell was staring at the boy with eyes that glistened, his lips pressed together, jaw tight, as if fighting something within himself. But he couldn't hide it, not anymore. Something inside him had shifted, and though he hadn't spoken yet, the world was about to see a side of Simon Cowell few had ever witnessed. And Mateo, with no sight at all, had just opened the world's eyes. The roar of applause thundered through the theater, shaking the very air around Mateo. The boy, still seated at the piano, kept his head bowed slightly, as though listening to the sound of the audience with his heart rather than his ears. His mother, standing at the side of the stage, had both hands pressed tightly over her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks in uncontrollable waves, tears of pride, relief, and a deep gratitude that her son's voice had been heard. The judges too were visibly moved. Heidi Klum was already clapping through tears, shaking her head in disbelief. Sofia Vergara leaned back in her chair, her hand pressed over her heart as she whispered in Spanish, que hermoso, how beautiful, how beautiful. Howie Mandel, normally quick with humor, was uncharacteristically quiet, his expression soft and contemplative, as though realizing he had just witnessed something bigger than talent. But all eyes eventually drifted toward the one man everyone waited to see, Simon Cowell. He sat still, his face unreadable. His pen lay forgotten on the table, his arms no longer folded in their usual defensive stance. Instead his hands rested flat on the desk, his gaze locked on the boy at the piano. His sharp blue eyes, so often piercing and unyielding, now seemed different, wet shiny. Simon blinked hard and looked down at the table for a moment, as though trying to regain control. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion, every twitch of his mouth, every attempt to hide what he was feeling. The audience, sensing what was happening, grew quieter, the applause tapering off into murmurs. Everyone knew Simon Cowell. Everyone knew his reputation. He didn't cry. He didn't do tears. He was the Iron Judge, the man whose blunt honesty could cut through the thickest skin, and yet here he was, shifting in his chair, his lips pressed tightly together as his chest rose and fell unevenly. Mateo, oblivious to the drama unfolding before him, lifted his head and smiled faintly. He couldn't see Simon's reaction, but he could feel something in the air, an energy, a silence more profound than words. Finally, Simon leaned back in his chair. His hand came up to his face, first rubbing at his eyes, then pressing against his forehead. He took a deep breath, but it shook as it left his body. For the first time in years, Simon Cowell was not the judge. He was the human being behind the judge's mask. A murmur spread through the audience. Some people gasped. Others whispered to each other, pointing toward the panel. The cameras caught every second. Simon's composure breaking, his throat working as he swallowed back emotion, his eyes reddening as tears finally spilled over. Simon Cowell was crying. It wasn't a single tear quickly brushed away. It was raw, unguarded, unplanned. His cheeks glistened, and he lowered his head, unable to hide it anymore. The man who had once built his image on toughness and blunt honesty was undone, not by a superstar diva, not by a polished professional, but by a 12-year-old blind boy who sang from the depths of his soul. The theater fell into silence again, this time reverent. The audience wasn't just watching a performance anymore, they were watching a transformation. Simon finally lifted his head, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke into the microphone. Mateo. He paused, the single name heavy in the air. His voice wavered, something the world had almost never heard before. I don't know how to put this into words. The crowd leaned forward, waiting. I have sat here for years. Simon continued, his accent thicker than usual, his tone quieter. I've listened to thousands of auditions. Some of them incredible, some forgettable. But what you just did, he stopped again, pressing a hand to his chest as if steadying himself. What you just did reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. Gasps swept the room. Even the judges looked stunned. Simon Cowell rarely spoke like this, rarely admitted vulnerability. He looked down for a moment, composing himself, then lifted his gaze back toward the boy. You didn't just sing, you told us your story. You made us feel every word, every note. And his voice cracked again, forcing him to pause. He shook his head, smiling weakly through tears. I'm not ashamed to say you broke me. The audience erupted into cheers, clapping and shouting words of love for Mateo. Some people stood again, applauding harder, moved by Simon's confession as much as by the performance itself. Mateo tilted his head at the sound of Simon's voice, his own smile widening. Thank you, sir, he said softly, gripping the edge of the piano as though holding on to the moment itself. Simon swallowed, blinking rapidly, still fighting the emotions surging through him. No, Mateo, he said firmly, his voice steadier now. Thank you for reminding us all what real talent, real heart, and real music looks like. This, he gestured to the boy, his hand trembling slightly. This is why this show exists. Behind the scenes, producers exchanged glances. They had never seen Simon like this, not in all the years of his career. He was famous for his biting wit, his impossible standards, his steel-like composure. And yet, a boy from the Philippines with no sight had managed to pierce through all of it in a matter of minutes. The audience began chanting Mateo's name, the sound echoing through the theater like a hymn.
Mateo! Mateo!
The boy sat still for a moment, listening, his face breaking into the widest smile he had shown yet. Simon leaned back in his chair again, wiping at his eyes openly now, no longer caring about the cameras or the world watching. In that moment, he wasn't the critic, he wasn't the icon of the industry, he was simply a man, grateful, humbled, and deeply moved by a child's courage and gift. The other judges leaned in closer to Simon, smiling knowingly. They too understood the magnitude of what had just happened. This wasn't just another audition, it was history. And as the chants of Mateo's name filled the theater, it was clear that something extraordinary had unfolded. A blind boy who had once been underestimated by so many had now moved the most unshakable man in the industry to tears. It was not just Mateo's victory. It was proof that music, when sung from the heart, has the power to break down even the strongest walls and remind the world of its shared humanity. For a long, fragile moment after Simon's voice cracked with emotion, the theater seemed suspended in time. Mateo still sat at the piano, small hands folded in his lap, listening intently. He could not see the tears streaming down the judges' faces, he could not see the audience leaning forward, their eyes glistening, but he could hear it, the trembling silence, the uneven breaths, the hushed reverence that followed his song. And then it happened. The audience surged to their feet, row after row rising as if pulled by a single thread of unity. First a few claps broke through the hush. Then a thunderous roar filled the hall, applause, cheers, whistles, shouts of joy. The sound grew louder, swelling like a wave crashing onto shore. Thousands of hands clapped in unison, voices crying out his name.
Mateo! Mateo!
The boy flinched slightly at the sudden roar, his ears overwhelmed by the thunderous ovation. But then as the sound wrapped around him, his lips parted in a smile. He tilted his head upward, as though trying to capture every note of this applause and paint it into his own private vision. From the side of the stage, Mateo's mother wept openly, pressing her trembling hands to her chest. She had always told him that people would hear his heart if they just gave him a chance. Now, watching an entire theater rise for her son, she realized those words had come true in ways she never imagined. Heidi Klum stood first among the judges, clapping with tears streaking down her cheeks. "Bravo!" she shouted, her voice carrying through the noise. "Bravo, Mateo!" Sofia Vergara rose next, clapping so hard her rings caught the stage lights. "You're an angel," she called out, her accent thick with emotion. "An angel sent to remind us of hope." Howie Mandel pushed his chair back, rising slowly, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. He clapped deliberately, each clap heavy with respect, his face still stunned. And then, the moment everyone held their breath for, Simon Cowell. For a second, he remained seated, staring at the boy. His eyes were still damp, his hands still resting on the desk. The crowd began to chant again, urging him on. "Stand up, Simon! Stand up!" Finally, with a visible exhale, Simon pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. The eruption of cheers doubled, shaking the rafters of the auditorium. Cameras zoomed in on his face, the faintest smile tugging at his lips, his eyes softened in a way that very few had ever seen. He clapped slowly, deliberately, as though each clap carried its own confession. "You broke me. You healed me. You reminded me why this matters." Mateo couldn't see Simon standing, but he could hear the difference in the applause. It grew deeper, more unified, more powerful. His small chest swelled with pride, and he placed his hands back on the piano, fingers brushing lightly against the keys, grounding himself in sound. The host, standing backstage, placed a hand over his heart, whispering into his microphone, "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've just witnessed history." The ovation went on, stretching for nearly 2 minutes, the kind of standing ovation reserved for legends, not for a boy barely 12 years old. And yet no one sat down, no one wanted the moment to end. Finally, as the applause softened into cheers, Simon leaned into his microphone. His voice was unsteady but clear. "Mateo," he paused, letting the crowd quiet just enough. "You just reminded me, and I think everyone here, what real music is about. It's not about perfection, it's not about fame, it's about truth. And you, young man, you just gave us the truth." The crowd roared again. Mateo tilted his head, listening carefully, his face lighting up. Simon continued, his tone softer now. "I want to tell you something. I've judged this show for many years. I've heard thousands of voices. But very few have ever touched me the way you just did. You didn't just sing a song, you opened your heart, and you let us all inside." The words hit the audience like a spark, igniting another wave of applause. Even people at home watching the broadcast, millions of miles away, would later say they felt as though Simon wasn't just talking to Mateo, but to them. Simon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his eyes locked on the boy. "I want you to remember something. You may not see the world the way we do, but tonight Matteo you showed the world something we desperately needed to see. Courage, love. The audience erupted again, clapping until their palms stung. Tears rolled freely down Matteo's mother's cheeks as she mouthed the words, "Thank you." Matteo, still smiling, bowed his head humbly. His voice, soft and trembling with gratitude, floated across the stage. "I may not see the world, but I can feel that you believe in me. And that's all I ever wanted." The theater went silent again, overwhelmed by the simplicity and power of his words. For a moment even the cameras panned across the crowd, capturing faces streaked with tears, mothers, fathers, children, strangers, each one touched in a way they couldn't explain. And then Simon, breaking all expectations, stood again and stepped toward the edge of the judges' table. He leaned forward into his mic and whispered words that carried across the hall. "You just reminded me why I fell in love with music." The crowd exploded once more, their cheers rising like thunder. It wasn't just applause anymore, it was gratitude, love, and all woven together. People waved their arms in the air, some holding phones, some simply clutching their hearts as if to keep them from bursting. Golden light spilled across the stage from above, catching on the boy's hair, the piano's polished surface, and the tears on Simon's face. It felt less like a talent show and more like a sacred moment, one of those rare times when the world pauses to remember the beauty of being human. Matteo turned his face toward the sound, smiling so widely it seemed to glow. He pressed a hand against his chest and whispered, "Salamat po." "Thank you," in Filipino. The audience responded with cheers, some even shouting back, "We love you Matteo." And in that instant, the boy who had once been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed had become something much more. He wasn't just a contestant, he wasn't just a singer, he was a reminder to the world of what it meant to be alive, to struggle, to overcome, and to give everything you have, even when you can't see what's in front of you. The ovation continued, a tidal wave of love Matteo could not see but could feel so deeply it painted the entire room in colors only his heart could imagine. The theater had become a cathedral of sound, cheers, applause, voices chanting Matteo's name as golden stage lights poured warmth over him. Yet, even amid the thunder of admiration, the boy sat still at the piano, his small hands folded gently on the keys. He tilted his head, listening not just to the noise but to the feeling within it. It wasn't just applause, it was love. Slowly, as the ovation began to quiet, Matteo turned his face toward the microphone. His unseeing eyes shone with something that looked like light, though it came from within. He waited until the crowd stilled, until the only sounds were the faint hum of stage lights and the soft sniffles of people wiping away tears. Then, with a voice both fragile and steady, he spoke. "I may not see the world," he said softly, his words carried across the vast theater, "but I can make people feel it." The audience gasped, the power of his statement striking deep. His voice wasn't rehearsed, wasn't polished, it was simply truth, and truth, spoken from the heart of a child, has a way of silencing even the loudest room. "I used to be scared," Matteo continued, clutching the microphone with both hands. "Scared that no one would ever understand me, scared that being blind meant I couldn't ever belong." His voice wavered but didn't break. "But tonight I feel like I belong, because music lets me see what my eyes cannot." His mother sobbed at the side of the stage, nodding her head over and over, whispering, "Yes baby, yes." The audience fell utterly silent, hanging on every word. Even the crew backstage stood frozen, some with tears on their faces, realizing this moment wasn't just for the show, it was for the world. Matteo smiled then, his small shoulders straightening. "I want people to know." He paused, his voice trembling but determined. "I want people to know that even if you can't see, even if you feel broken, you can still shine, you can still be light for someone else." The theater erupted again, cheers filling every corner, but this time it wasn't wild or chaotic, it was reverent, like an amen shouted from a congregation. Strangers hugged, children clapped their tiny hands, and somewhere in the crowd, a man whispered, "That boy just changed my life." Simon Cowell leaned back in his chair, his face still wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. He shook his head slowly, then leaned toward his mic. His voice, low and husky with emotion, broke through the cheers. "Matto," he said, pausing as the crowd quieted once more. "I don't think I've ever, in all my years of doing this, seen something as pure and powerful as what you just gave us." Matteo's lips curved into a shy smile. Simon's hand hovered over the panel in front of him. He looked at the boy, then at the audience, then back at the boy again, his voice softened. "And I think I know, this is a moment the world will never forget." The crowd sensed it before it happened. Simon pressed the golden buzzer. The room exploded. A shower of shimmering golden confetti burst from the ceiling, cascading down like 1,000 stars. The golden pieces danced through the air, glimmering in the spotlights as they rained over Matteo and his piano. The audience screamed, their cheers reaching a fever pitch. Judges stood once again, clapping and laughing through tears as the iconic music of the golden buzzer filled the hall. Mateo flinched at first at the sudden roar, then reached out instinctively, holding his hands in front of him. A golden piece of confetti brushed against his palm, his fingers curled around it, feeling its texture, its weightless presence. He laughed a sound pure and bright, and began catching more of the falling stars, letting them slip between his fingers like golden rain. For a boy who had never seen color, never witnessed the glittering beauty of confetti falling from the sky, this was his vision. He couldn't see the gold, but he could hear the cheers, he could feel the flakes, he could sense the love surrounding him. And in that moment, it was as if he could see, more clearly than anyone else in the room. His mother rushed onto the stage, tears streaming, wrapping her arms around her son. She pressed her face into his shoulder, sobbing with pride. "You did it, Mateo," she whispered over and over. "You did it, baby, the world heard you." Simon, still standing, spoke again, his voice echoing over the applause. "Mateo," he said firmly, "you're not just a contestant, you're not just a singer. You are a reminder to all of us that sometimes the greatest vision comes from those who cannot see, and sometimes, the toughest hearts," he placed a hand on his chest, his voice breaking again, "are broken only to show us how deeply they can love." The words rippled through the room, leaving not a dry eye in sight. Mateo, holding on to his mother, leaned toward the microphone one final time. His voice was calm, certain, filled with the kind of wisdom only a child who had overcome so much could carry. "Don't be afraid of the dark," he said. "Because even in the dark, there is always music, there is always light." The audience roared once more, rising to their feet in a second standing ovation as the golden confetti continued to rain. The chant of his name filled the hall again, louder, stronger, echoing into eternity. "Mateo, Mateo," and there, standing beneath a sky of golden stars, a blind boy from the Philippines had not only won the hearts of millions, he had given them back their hope,